The bird that forgot the cage was open. Carl Jung observed that the psyche will keep a door locked long after the key has been returned, and call the locking itself fate, as though the latch turned on its own. Jung wrote in Ion, in the section where he traced the shadow through the architecture of the self, that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate, and he meant it plainly, not as a comfort, but as a diagnosis. The thing you refuse to look at does not disappear. It simply steps outside you and starts wearing the mask of circumstance, of bad luck, of a world that will not let you move, and Jung would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? The bird does not test the bars each morning. It simply stops flying at the old height, one grey season after another, and then one day the door swings open on its hinge and the wings do not even lift, because the wings were never waiting on the door. They were waiting on a decision that was never made consciously, only endured. And this is the ache underneath so many lives that look, from outside, like freedom. A job you could leave, a room you could walk out of, a habit you could set down, all standing open, and something in you simply does not test it. And the strange part is that no one locked it recently. No jailer checks the latch each morning. The door has simply been left standing, unremarked, while the bird arranges its whole day around a bar that was removed years ago. I say this quietly, in front of the fire, because I do not think you are lazy, and I do not think you are broken. I think you are, like most of us, living inside an old arrangement that once kept you safe and has long since stopped noticing that the danger passed. So let me offer you 3 lines to say, not as magic, only as a kind of pointing. I do not need a bigger door, I need a longer look at the one already open. I stop confusing an old fear with a present fact. Say it with me. I make the unconscious conscious. And again, slower this time, I make the unconscious conscious. If this kind of seeing matters to you, then subscribe now, quietly, so that tomorrow's teaching finds you the way this one did. And if something in you just went still while I was speaking, if some door you forgot about flickered into view, then type the 2 words, "face it," down in the comments, and let that be your seal for tonight. The first key is this: the cage was never the room, it was a complex. And a complex, in Jung's vocabulary, is not a bad mood or a rough week. It is a splinter of the psyche that broke off once, around some real threat, and organized itself into a small standing government inside you, with its own memory and its own reflexes, formed the day the danger was real, and never once audited since. Imagine a woman who learned at 9 that speaking up at the dinner table brought a slap, not every night, but often enough. And by 29, she sits in meetings with her hand halfway raised, and something quietly lowers it for her. The table is different, the room is different, the people are different, but the complex does not update itself by observing new rooms. It updates only when she looks directly at the old one. And if you asked her why her hand came down, she would not say, "I am afraid of the old table." She would say, "It was not the right moment," or "It was not that important anyway." The complex never announces itself honestly. It always arrives dressed as good judgment, as simply reading the room. This is its oldest disguise. Think of a man who has rented the same small apartment for 11 years, telling himself each spring he is saving toward something better, while the truth, quietly, is that his father lost a house once, and something in the sun decided that wanting more space was how a man invited ruin. The lease renews itself, and so does the fear. Neither one examined, or think of a young father who says nothing when his own work is quietly credited to someone else, and tells himself he simply does not care for recognition, when what actually happened is smaller and older. A boy who once learned that claiming credit at his own family's table invited ridicule rather than praise, and built, without choosing to, a whole personality around not wanting things, and calls it humility now, when it was once simply protection. Notice how patient the disguise is. It does not feel like fear from the inside. It feels like your own settled character, And that calm is often the very sound of an old door being guarded so quietly that even the guard has forgotten there was ever a door. And if you sat this man down and told him plainly, "You are afraid," he would likely correct you, gently, and tell you he is simply not that kind of person, which is exactly how thoroughly the disguise has settled into the furniture of his personality. This is the secret hiding in tonight's title. The cage door swung open years ago. The boss is not her father. The landlord is not his father either. And still the bird sits, because nobody told the bird, and the bird cannot be told from outside. It can only be shown, patiently, by the one who lives behind its eyes. So here is the first small mercy. You have not failed to leave. You have simply never been introduced to the part of you still guarding a door that was bricked shut decades ago, and has since been torn down entirely. I stop guarding a door that no longer exists. The second key is this. A complex does not wait for your permission. It acts with its own charge, its own timing, and its own will, which is why Jung wrote plainly, complexes can have us, not we have complexes, but complexes can have us. And he did not arrive at this by guessing. In 1910, he ran what he called the word association test. A subject sat across from him in an ordinary chair, and Jung read out a list of ordinary words, one at a time. Table, water, money, mother, knife, and the subject said back the first word that came to mind, while Jung sat with a stopwatch, timing every answer down to the fraction of a second. Most words came back in under 2 seconds, clean and unremarkable, but every so often a single word would land, and something would stall, half a second longer. A strange word substituted where a plain one should have come, a small cough that meant nothing, and meant everything. And in one case Jung recorded, a young man was asked about a sum of 70 francs missing from an office till, and word after word came back smoothly, until certain words touching on money, on locks, on guilt, began producing these small betrayals of timing that no lie could smooth over, because they happened before the lie had time to form. And Jung did not need a confession yet. The stopwatch had already told him where the charge was buried, and later, the man did confess. But here is what I want you to sit with tonight. He had not consciously decided each morning to keep lying. The lie was being run, underneath his own intentions, by a complex that flinched every time the true subject came near it, and this proves that the conscious will, the part of you that likes to think it stands at the wheel, is not always first to the scene. Sometimes it is the second car to arrive, explaining an accident it did not cause. You do not need a laboratory or a stopwatch of brass and glass to see this. You have your own stopwatch running quietly every day. It is the half second before you answer a question about your finances, the small laugh that arrives too quickly when someone mentions your family, the sentence you start twice before you say it plainly, the message you type and delete and type again before you finally press send. Imagine an old friend asking, gently, how are things really going with your marriage? And notice, if you can, the tiny pause before your answer, not the words themselves, the pause, that half beat of static before the sentence assembles itself. The sound of some old file being pulled from a drawer before the mouth is permitted to open, and if you watch closely across enough ordinary days, you will find your own private list of stalling words. Money, perhaps, or your father, or the word enough, each one a place where the timing changes just slightly, and nobody but you would notice. And once you start noticing, you will find the list is not long, it rarely is. Most of us are governed by 3 or 4 such words, worn completely smooth by decades of quiet handling. None of that is nothing. Each is a tiny, honest, unbribable measurement, telling you exactly where a complex still stands guard. This is what a cage is truly made of. Not steel, not even memory, but flinch. A reaction that arrives before the self does and announces itself as simply who you are, when it is only who a wounded corner of you learned to be once, and never once retimed since. I no longer mistake my flinch for my will. The third key is this, and it deserves following carefully. Jung recalled, in his own memoirs, a woman of real culture and real gentleness, who one day, in a moment of sudden anger, slapped her own daughter, and was afterward horrified at herself, not because she was cruel, everyone who knew her agreed she was not, but because the hand had moved before any decision she recognized as her own had been made. The complex had reached the muscles first, and the actual conscious woman, the one who loved her daughter, arrived a half-second late to a scene her own arm had already finished. This is not a story about a bad mother. It is a story about how thin the wire really is between what we call ourselves and what we call our reflexes. We like to imagine a single figure standing at the control panel of the self, weighing, deciding, then acting. But Jung's clinical years kept turning up a stranger arrangement. A small government inside the psyche that can, for one bright charged second, seize the motor nerves directly and hand the conscious self a fact after the fact, "I did that," without ever once being asked whether it agreed. Think of it like an understudy who has memorized your lines so perfectly that the audience never notices the substitution. Only you notice, backstage, a beat too late, that you were not the one who walked on. Imagine a quiet man who has never once, in 20 years, raised his voice at work, and one ordinary afternoon, a junior colleague misfiles a report, a small thing, easily fixed, and he hears his own voice come out sharp and cold before he has decided to speak at all, and afterward, he sits at his desk, turning the moment over. Not because the correction was unfair, but because the tone did not feel like his. It felt borrowed, and it was. Borrowed from some earlier room where being overlooked once cost him something real, and if you asked him, later, what he was actually angry about, he would find, if he was honest, that it had almost nothing to do with the report at all. Now let me walk you through an ordinary day, so this stops sounding like something that only happens to women in old memoirs. 7 in the morning, one flagged email tightens your jaw before you have finished the subject line. 9:30, a mild disagreement heats your face as though you had been accused of something far larger. Noon, you eat lunch alone at your desk, telling yourself you are simply tired, though nothing about you is tired. 1 o'clock, a small joke lands wrong, and you insist, quite convincingly, that it did not bother you. 4 o'clock, you agree to something you did not want to agree to, and only notice the resentment an hour later. 6 in the evening, you snap at someone you love over a dish left in the sink, and the size of the reaction has no honest relation to the size of the dish. None of these were chosen in the way we normally mean choice. Each was constellated, which is Jung's term for what happens the instant a stimulus finds a live complex, and the complex answers on your behalf, faster than deliberation, wearing your own voice so convincingly that you never think to ask who actually spoke, and by the time you lie down that night, you may have gone through 6 such moments without once suspecting that 6 different old residents had each taken a short turn speaking through you. And here is the part worth saying plainly, because this could sound merely troubling, when it is, underneath, strangely hopeful. If the hand that slapped, and the jaw that tightened, and the voice that snapped over a dish were truly you, the whole and settled you, there would be nowhere to go from here, but they are old residents acting in your name, understudies who learned the part once, in an emergency, and never stopped rehearsing it long after the play changed, which means the you asking these questions right now, quietly, by a fire, is already standing at a small distance from them. And that distance is the only room individuation ever needs to begin its work in. So here is the exercise, and I mean this literally. Pause for a moment tonight and pick one real moment from this past week where your reaction felt too large for its cause, just one, and ask only this: how old does this feeling feel? Not how old are you? How old does the feeling feel? 5, 9, 16. You will very often get an answer, arriving almost before you finish asking, faster than any answer you could reason your way to. And that speed itself is a clue, because reasoned answers take their time and old feelings do not. They have been standing ready for years, waiting only to be asked. I ask my reactions how old they feel. The fourth key is this, and it turns the lamp toward you now, because up to this point it has been easy to nod along, imagining the woman with the raised hand. the man with the missing francs, safely at a distance, comfortably someone else's story. But I want to ask you something plainer. Is there a door in your life right now that you already, quietly, know is open? A conversation you could have, a boundary you could finally set, a room you could finally leave, a version of your work you could finally attempt, and something in you answers, not yet, not like that, not me, and calls this caution, calls this being realistic, calls this simply knowing yourself, when what it may actually be is a complex still guarding a door that was unlocked long ago. Without telling you, let me make this less abstract. Imagine a man who keeps a folder on an old laptop, a folder of applications for a different kind of work entirely, work that actually matches who he has become, and he updates that folder faithfully. Every birthday, a slightly better resume, a slightly kinder cover letter, and then he closes the laptop. And nothing is sent, not this year, not the year before. And if you asked him why, he would give you a very sound reason. The market is difficult, the timing is wrong, his family needs the stability, and every reason would sound, on its own, entirely sensible, which is exactly how a complex prefers to travel, dressed as good sense, never as fear, because fear would be noticed and argued with. But good sense gets waved straight through the checkpoint, year after year, while the actual door, the one 3 feet to his left, gathers a little more dust. And if you asked him to picture actually clicking send, notice what happens in his chest before his mind even finishes composing an objection. That tightening arrives first, and the objection is built afterward, almost obediently. To explain it, this is not a failure of courage, and I want to be very plain about that, because courage was never the missing ingredient. What was missing was the noticing. You cannot summon courage against a threat you have not yet correctly located, and most of us spend years being brave against the wrong wall, bracing against a danger from decades ago, while the real door stands wide open, 3 feet to the left, patient, unremarked, gathering dust, waiting not for our bravery, but simply for our attention to finally land on the right spot. And it is worth saying that this is rarely one great door. More often, it is several small ones, a phone call postponed, a truth softened until it says nothing, a talent quietly shelved, each one small enough to seem unimportant on its own, and each one, together, forming the actual shape of the cage. So ask yourself tonight, gently, without needing an answer immediately, what is the folder I keep updating and never send? What is the door I have grown so used to standing beside that I have mistaken the standing itself for wisdom? I stop confusing the wrong wall for the real door. If tonight's teaching is finding something in you, then let it find you again tomorrow. Subscribe now, quietly, so the next key does not have to wait for you to remember to come looking. The fifth key is the one that holds the others together, and I want to walk it slowly, because it is not one move but four, folded into a single motion, and each deserves its own weight before we move to the next. This key is the whole hinge of tonight's teaching, and a hinge is a small thing that carries a very large door. First, name the complex, not vaguely, but as though it were a person, because in a sense it very nearly is, a splinter psyche. Jung called it, with its own memory and its own voice, running on a separate clock from yours. So instead of saying, I am just anxious about speaking up, try, there is a part of me that still believes speaking up gets punished. And notice how the sentence changes shape the moment you give the pattern a pronoun of its own. It stops being the whole of you and becomes a resident inside you, paying no rent in self-awareness for decades, which is the first distance you will ever gain from it, because you cannot negotiate with a fog, but you can begin a conversation with a resident who has a name, even an informal one, even just the 9-year-old, or the anxious one, and a thing with a name has an edge, and a thing with an edge is a thing you can eventually stand beside. Rather than a weather you are simply soaked in without recourse, some people find it useful to write the name down once, plainly, on paper, just to feel how different it is to say there is a frightened boy in me who guards the mail, than to say, I am simply a nervous person. Second sentence has no door in it at all. The first one does. Second, find the room the complex is actually still guarding, not the room you are standing in now, but the original one. Ask, when did this pattern make sense? When was silence actually the safer choice? And honor that origin honestly, because Jung insisted, though it gets lost in the popular retelling, that the shadow, the complex, the old wound, is not simply villainy to be expelled. Most of what hides in there began as intelligence, as a 9-year-old's very accurate reading of a genuinely unsafe table. Imagine a man who learned young that his father's moods could turn without warning, that the safest position in any room was near the door and near silence. And for years, that reading kept him unharmed. So when he is 45 and cannot disagree with a business partner even once, the pattern is not malfunctioning, it is simply still filing the partner under father, guarding a door out of a house sold long ago. The complex was born accurate, and then it forgot to update its file, which is very different from being broken. And this matters because so many of us quietly hate a part of ourselves for a caution it learned honestly, when it needs not condemnation, but a corrected map. The way you might tell an old employee the company moved buildings years ago and the mail no longer goes to that address. Or imagine a woman raised by a mother who read every closed door as a secret being kept from her. So she learned that privacy itself was betrayal, and now, 30 years later, she feels a hot flash of dread whenever her own teenager closes a bedroom door. Not because anything is wrong, but because a very old alarm, tuned to a very old house, is going off in a house that was never hers. The alarm is not lying about the past. It is only misreporting the present. And the work is never to silence it violently, but to walk it room by room and show it that this door, this year, this child, is not that door, and this second motion alone, simply granting the old fear its original good reason, often does more to quiet a complex than any amount of arguing with it ever could. Third, and this is the part almost nobody does, test the door in the present tense, on purpose, in some small enough way that it will not undo you if it creaks. If the complex says, "Do not speak in this meeting," speak once, briefly, on something low stakes, and observe what actually happens, not what you fear will happen. Imagine someone who has gone 8 years without asking for a raise, not because the number was never justified, but because some old resident equates asking with being seen as greedy. So instead of the whole confrontation at once, she tests the hinge first, asking a manager for a small schedule adjustment, something almost beneath notice, and watches carefully. And what happens, usually, is nothing catastrophic. The sky stays exactly where it was, and that small, unremarkable fact becomes real evidence, gathered under real conditions, not imagined evidence gathered at 3 in the morning. This is Jung's quiet method in miniature. Not confrontation, not exorcism, simply observation under real conditions, because a complex fed only imagined catastrophes for 20 years has never once been given the data of an actual open door, and patient, repeated data is the only thing that ever retrains an old reflex, not a single dramatic leap, but small tested hinges, one after another, because a complex guarding a door for 30 years will not be talked out of its post by one grand gesture. It needs the same small proof again and again, the way a nervous animal is coaxed not by one loud kindness, but by 100 quiet ones, and each small hinge tested successfully becomes, quietly, evidence the next test can lean on, so the 10th attempt is never as frightening as the first. Fourth, hold the gap between the old fact and the new fact without rushing to erase either one. The old fact is real. The table was once unsafe. The manager who once punished a question may have existed once, in some earlier room, and the new fact is also real. This table, this year, is not that table. Jung's teaching on the shadow was never about winning a war against the past. It was about widening the room until both facts could stand in it together. the frightened 9-year-old and the capable adult. Without either one having to be a liar, you do not have to declare the fear was foolish. Only notice, it is describing a room you no longer live in. And this holding, more than any single insight, is the daily practice, because the old fact visits, certain mornings, and your task is only to say, quietly, yes, that was once true, and also, this is what is true now, letting both sentences sit at the same table, without either shouting down the other, and over time, with enough repetition, the visits grow shorter, not because the old fact was defeated, but because it has finally been heard clearly enough that it no longer needs to shout to be believed. Now here is why this matters more than a tidy self-improvement point. You have likely seen a popular line online saying that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will run your life, and you will call it fate. That exact wording is not Jung's sentence. It is a modern paraphrase, but a fair one, of what he wrote in Ion, where his real words were, "When an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate, and the difference matters, because the paraphrase sounds mystical, as though the universe arranges events around your blind spots, when Jung meant something far more sober. The pattern you refuse to see does not vanish, it keeps operating, and because you cannot see it operating from inside, you experience its results as things simply happening to you. The job that always ends the same way, the raise that never quite gets asked for, the meeting where your hand never quite rises. Not fate, not curse, only an old resident, still on duty, guarding a room torn down years ago, and nobody thought to tell him the war was over. So this week, pick just one door, and do not fling it wide, only test the hinge, ask the small favor, speak the low-stakes sentence, watch, honestly, what the room actually does, name the resident, honor the room it once guarded, test the hinge gently, and hold the old fact beside the new one, without asking either to lie. I let the old guard finally stand down. The sixth key is this, and I want to leave you gently here, because I do not believe Jung's teaching was ever meant to end in shame. The bird that forgot the cage was open is not a foolish bird. It is simply a bird that learned, once, in a moment that truly mattered, that stillness kept it alive, and stillness, learned that thoroughly, does not undo itself just because the danger passed. It undoes itself the way all real things undo, slowly, through small tests, through one wingbeat that does not bring the sky down. Let me tell you about a woman who slept every night of her childhood with the hallway light left burning, because the dark once held something in her house that was genuinely worth fearing, a raised voice, a door that slammed without warning, and the light was not superstition, it was a real precaution against a real danger, and she carried that light with her for 30 years, into apartments where nothing had ever slammed, into a marriage with a man who had never once raised his voice in anger, and every night, without quite deciding to, she reached for the switch, and if you had asked her why, she would have said, "I just sleep better this way," which is the same soft disguise every old complex wears, and one winter the bulb finally burned out, and she lay there in the actual dark, waiting, the way you wait for a blow you have been trained to expect, and nothing came, only the ordinary dark of an ordinary house, and she told me afterward that she cried, not from fear, but from something closer to grief, for all the years she had spent lighting a hallway against a danger that had been gone for decades, and what struck her most, she said, was how quiet the dark actually was, how undramatic, after 30 years of bracing for it. This is what the sixth key finally asks of you. Not a leap, not a grand renunciation, only this. Let the bulb burn out once, in whatever small form that takes in your own life. Let one door stay closed that you have always left ajar out of old habit. Let one silence pass without your rushing to fill it. And notice, simply notice, what the dark actually contains this time. Freedom rarely arrives as a single dramatic flight out of the cage. More often, it arrives as one small proof, repeated, that the room beyond the door will not punish you the way the old room once did. And each proof makes the next test a little easier, until one day You notice you have simply been living, for some while now, on the far side of a door you spent years afraid to touch. You are not late to your own freedom. You are only in the middle of noticing the door, which is further along than most people ever get, because most people never even glance at the hinge. They only tend the old light, faithfully, forever. I test the door gently, and I do not need to fly far tonight, only far enough to prove the hinge still turns. Here is the whole picture. The cage was never the room. It was a complex. Complexes can have us before we have noticed them at all. The flinch and the reaction, and even the raised hand can move a half second before the self arrives. One honest look at a single overreaction can reveal how old the reaction truly feels. Most of us are being brave against the wrong wall, while the real door stands open a few feet away, and the four small motions, naming the pattern, honoring its old accuracy, testing the door gently in the present, and holding the old fact and the new fact together without lying about either one. These were never 6 separate keys at all. They were 6 turns of a single one, the turning of attention itself. The same patient light Jung called making the unconscious conscious, brought to bear again and again on the same quiet hinge. So wherever you are tonight, however long the door has been standing open without your knowing it, I want you to hear this kindly. You were not foolish to stay still for as long as you did. You were faithful to a danger that was once entirely real. And faithfulness like that does not deserve scorn. It deserves an update. So once more, gently, say it with me in your own time this week. I make the unconscious conscious. And let that be the whole of the work for now. Not a leap, not a grand escape, only a longer look at a door that may have been standing open, patiently, kindly, for far longer than you knew. And the only question worth carrying to bed tonight is the simplest one. Which door, in your life, might already be open?